The Fractured Pearl Part 1. The Shunned Daughter. The morning bell of the Academy of Virtues rang across the marble courtyard, and Celeste Thornwick knew it would be another day of whispered cruelties and averted gazes. She clutched her leather satchel against her chest with her good arm, while her withered left arm hung uselessly at her side, hidden beneath the folds of her academy cloak. The other students flowed around her like water around a stone, careful not to let their pristine uniforms brush against her imperfection. Look at her," she heard someone whisper behind her, and Celeste's cheeks burned with familiar shame. The stutter that plagued her speech had worsened since starting at the academy 3 months ago, as if the very air of this place strangled her voice. The Academy of Virtues stood as the crown jewel of the kingdom of Stellareth, its gleaming spires, reaching toward heaven like prayers made of white stone. Here the nobility sent their children to be molded into perfect specimens of grace, beauty, and intellect. Here, imperfection was not merely discouraged, it was treated as a moral failing. Celeste hurried through the grand hall, where portraits of flawless alumni gazed down with painted eyes that seemed to judge her every step. Their faces were symmetrical, their postures proud, their achievements carved in golden letters beneath each frame. She had memorized every face during her first week, searching desperately for someone who might look like her, someone who bore any mark of difference. She found none. Miss Thornwick. The voice cut through the morning bustle like a blade through silk. Professor Aldrich Blackwood stood at the entrance to the main lecture hall, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his dark robes immaculate, his pale eyes cold as winter frost, fixed upon her with the same expression one might reserve for something unpleasant found on the bottom of a shoe. Yes, Professor?" Celeste managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're late for morning assembly. Again." He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of bergamot and disapproval that always surrounded him. "Perhaps if you spent less time adjusting your appearance and more time developing punctuality, you might achieve some small measure of acceptability." The students nearby snickered, and Celeste felt her throat close up entirely. Professor Blackwood's lips curved in what might have been called a smile on anyone else's face, but on his, it resembled the expression of a cat cornering a mouse. "Take your seat, Miss Thornwick. Try not to be a distraction." Celeste scurried to the back corner where she always sat, alone at a desk meant for two, as Professor Blackwood began the daily recitation of the Academy's virtues: excellence in form, perfection in function, beauty in being. She stared down at her hands. Her right hand, strong and capable, lay flat on the desk. Her left, twisted and small, remained hidden in her lap like a shameful secret. The morning lectures blurred together in a haze of humiliation. In deportment class, Madame Rosalind had her demonstrate the incorrect way to curtsy, using Celeste's uneven balance as a cautionary example for the other students. In literature, when called upon to recite a passage from the kingdom's epic poems, her stutter rendered the beautiful verses clumsy and broken. Each stumble over consonants brought fresh waves of snickers from her classmates. But it wasn't until the midday meal that the day's cruelest blow fell. Celeste sat alone at a small table near the kitchen doors, picking at her bread and trying to ignore the animated conversations happening at every other table. The dining hall buzzed with talk of the upcoming Virtue Gala, where students would present themselves to potential suitors and future patrons. It was the social event of the academy year, and invitations were extended only to those deemed worthy, representatives of the institution. "Celeste!" a bright voice called across the hall, and every head turned. Cordelia Thornwick approached with the fluid grace of a swan, her golden hair catching the light from the crystal chandeliers, her smile radiant enough to illuminate the darkest corner. She was everything Celeste was not: perfectly proportioned, eloquent, gifted in every art from music to mathematics. She was also Celeste's older sister. "Sister, dear," Cordelia said, settling gracefully into the chair across from her. Several other students immediately clustered around their table, drawn by Cordelia's magnetic presence like moths to flame. "I have such wonderful news." Celeste looked up, hope flickering in her chest despite herself. Perhaps Cordelia had come to invite her to sit with her friends, Or maybe she had convinced their parents to. "I've been chosen as this year's Virtue Princess," Cordelia announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent dining hall. "Can you imagine? Of all the students at the academy, they selected me to represent the highest ideals of our institution." The gathered students burst into congratulations, and Cordelia basked in their adoration like a flower turning toward the sun. But her eyes remained fixed on Celeste, and there was something sharp glinting in their blue depths. "Of course," Cordelia continued, her voice taking on a tone of practiced sympathy, "the selection committee was very clear about maintaining the academy's standards. They specifically mentioned that association with certain elements could reflect poorly on the chosen representative." Her gaze deliberately dropped to Celeste's hidden arm. "I do hope you understand, dear sister. It's nothing personal, but I simply cannot be seen spending time with you anymore. It wouldn't be appropriate for someone in my position." The words hit Celeste like physical blows. Around the table she could see understanding dawn on the other students' faces, followed quickly by cruel amusement. Someone whispered, "Even her own sister won't claim her," and the comment spread through the hall in ripples of laughter. Cordelia rose from her chair with the same fluid grace with which she'd arrived. "I do hope you'll understand," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some of us are meant for greatness, and some of us—" She shrugged delicately, leaving the sentence unfinished but devastatingly clear. As Cordelia glided away with her entourage, Celeste sat frozen in her chair, feeling every eye in the dining hall upon her. The weight of their stares, the whispered comments, the barely suppressed laughter, it all pressed down on her until she could barely breathe. She fled. Her feet carried her through the academy's endless corridors, without conscious direction, past classrooms where other students learned the arts of perfection, past trophy cases filled with awards for excellence, past everything that reminded her of her own inadequacy. Tears blurred her vision, making the familiar halls seem like a maze, and she stumbled more than once as her uneven gait betrayed her. Finally, she found herself in a part of the academy she'd never seen before. The corridors here were narrower, the stonework older, and dust motes danced in the afternoon light filtering through grimy windows. A heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar at the end of the hallway, and beyond it, Celeste glimpsed something that made her heart skip. Books. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, stretching from floor to ceiling in towering shelves that disappeared into shadow. This was clearly a library, but not like the pristine study halls she knew. This library felt forgotten, abandoned, as if it had been left behind when the academy decided that only perfect things deserved to exist. Celeste pushed through the door and stepped into another world. The air smelled of old paper and forgotten dreams. Shafts of dusty sunlight fell across reading tables piled high with volumes bound in cracked leather. Some books lay open as if their readers had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. Others were stacked in precarious towers that seemed to defy gravity through sheer stubbornness. For the first time in months, Celeste felt herself relax. Here, surrounded by stories and knowledge that bore the beautiful imperfections of age and use, she didn't feel like a mistake. She pulled a book from a nearby shelf, a collection of fairy tales with illustrations that had faded to gentle pastels, and settled into a window seat worn smooth by countless previous occupants. She was so absorbed in a story about a princess who saved her kingdom not through beauty but through cleverness that she didn't notice she was no longer alone, until a soft voice spoke behind her. "That's one of my favorites." Celeste spun around, her heart hammering, and found herself looking at a young man perhaps a few years older than herself. His clothes were simple, rough brown trousers and a shirt that had seen many washings, and his hands bore the calluses of someone who worked with tools. His dark hair fell across his forehead in waves that no academy barber would have permitted, and his eyes were the warm brown of freshly turned earth. What struck her most was that he was looking directly at her face, meeting her eyes without flinching or glancing away in discomfort. When was the last time someone had looked at her that way? "I'm sorry," she stammered, clutching the book to her chest. "I didn't know anyone was here. I'll leave." "Please don't." His voice was gentle, with none of the sharp edges she was accustomed to hearing. "This place is meant for reading, and you're the first person I've seen actually do that, in months." He stepped closer, moving with an easy confidence that spoke of someone comfortable in his own skin. "I'm Jasper. I take care of the forgotten corners of this place, the parts they don't show to visitors." "Celeste," she whispered, then immediately wished she hadn't given her name. Now he would know who she was, would have heard the stories, would understand why even her own sister had cast her aside. But Jasper simply nodded as if her name were a perfectly ordinary thing to share. "It's a beautiful name," he said. "Like the stars." He gestured to the book in her hands. "What do you think of that one so far?" "It's..." She struggled to find words that wouldn't betray her stutter. "Different. The princess isn't beautiful. Does that bother you?" The question surprised her. "No," she said, and realized she meant it. "It makes her more real." Jasper smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. "Exactly. The best stories aren't about perfect people. They're about people who find ways to be extraordinary despite their flaws, or maybe because of them." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. There was understanding in his eyes, the kind that only came from personal experience. She found herself wondering what flaws he carried, what imperfections had led him to this forgotten corner of a place, obsessed with perfection. "This library," she said, changing the subject before her courage failed her. "Why is it abandoned?" Jasper's expression darkened slightly. "The new headmaster decided it didn't fit the academy's image. Too old, too cluttered, too..." He searched for the word. "Too human, I suppose. They built that pristine study hall in the main building instead, with its white shelves and perfect organization, but they couldn't bring themselves to destroy these books, so they just locked the door and pretended this place never existed. Like they do with people," Celeste said softly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Their eyes met, across the dusty air, and in that moment she felt something she had almost forgotten existed, the possibility of being understood. Jasper didn't offer empty reassurances or hollow compliments. He simply nodded, acknowledging the truth of what she'd said without trying to soften its edges. "Would you..." she began, then stopped, terrified of the rejection that seemed to follow every attempt she made to connect with another person. "Would I what?" he prompted gently. "Would you mind if I came back? To read, I mean. I won't disturb you, I promise. She gestured helplessly at the books surrounding them. "This is the first place I've felt like I could breathe since I came to this academy." "I'd like that," Jasper said, and she could hear the sincerity in his voice. "These books have been waiting for someone who would appreciate them. I think they've been lonely." As if summoned by their conversation, the academy's afternoon bell rang in the distance, calling students to their next classes. Celeste's heart sank as reality crashed back over her. Soon she would have to return to the world of whispered insults and casual cruelty, where her very existence was treated as an embarrassment. "I have to go," she said, reluctantly closing the fairy tale book. "The book will be here when you return," Jasper said, "and so will I if you'd like." Celeste felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something she had thought the academy had killed forever. Hope. As she made her way back through the winding corridors toward her afternoon classes, she carried with her the memory of kind eyes and a gentle voice, of a place where stories about imperfect heroes were treasured rather than scorned. For the first time since arriving at the Academy of Virtues, she had found someone, who saw her not as a mistake to be hidden, but as a person worth knowing. She didn't yet understand that this chance encounter would change everything. That the young man in the forgotten library would soon prove that sometimes the most precious treasures are found in the places others have abandoned. All she knew was that tomorrow she would return to that dusty sanctuary, and for the first time in her life someone would be genuinely glad to see her. The afternoon classes passed in their usual blur of humiliation, but beneath it all, Celeste carried a secret warmth. She had found a place where she belonged, and perhaps, though she hardly dared to hope, she had found someone who might see past her fractured exterior to whatever lay beneath. She had no way of knowing that her discovery of the old library and her meeting with Jasper had not gone entirely unnoticed. Professor Blackwood had eyes and ears throughout the academy, and he took a particular interest in students who strayed from their prescribed paths. Change was coming to the academy, of virtues, though whether it would bring salvation or destruction remained to be seen. The hidden treasure. 3 weeks had passed since Celeste first discovered the forgotten library, and they had been the most precious weeks of her life. Every afternoon, when the academy's rigid schedule finally released its grip on her time, she would slip through the shadowed corridors to her sanctuary. There, surrounded by stories that celebrated the beauty of imperfection, she would find Jasper waiting with a warm smile and another tale to share. Today felt different, though. As Celeste pushed open the heavy wooden door, she found Jasper standing at one of the tall windows, his shoulders tense with worry. Afternoon light carved sharp angles across his face, revealing an expression she had never seen before. Fear. "Jasper?" she called softly, her voice steadier now than it had been in months. The stutter that had plagued her since childhood seemed to ease in this place, as if the very air here whispered that she was safe to speak her truth. He turned at the sound of her voice, and relief flooded his features. "Celeste, I was beginning to think—" He shook his head, running a hand through his dark hair. "We need to talk." The serious tone made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. "What's wrong?" Jasper moved toward her, his movements careful and deliberate. "Someone knows about our meetings. Professor Blackwood has been asking questions about the old wing, about who might have access to the forgotten areas of the academy." Celeste's hands went cold. She had grown careless in her happiness, allowing herself to believe that her small slice of joy could exist without consequence in a place that punished any deviation from perfection. "I see," she whispered, sinking into her favorite reading chair. "Then I suppose this is goodbye." "No." The word came out sharper than Jasper had intended, and he immediately softened his tone. "No, Celeste. I won't let them take this from you. From us." He knelt beside her chair, his earth-brown eyes intense with determination. "But there are things I need to tell you first. Things about who I really am." She looked at him in confusion. For weeks, she had assumed he was simply a maintenance worker, someone the academy employed to tend to its forgotten corners. But now, studying his face in the afternoon light, she noticed details that had escaped her before. The way he spoke of literature with the passion of a scholar, the careful precision of his handwriting when he left notes in the margins of her favorite books, the depth of knowledge he displayed about subjects far beyond his supposed station. "My real name is Jasper Nightingale," he began, settling cross-legged on the floor beside her chair. 3 years ago, I was a literature professor here at the academy. I was young, idealistic, and foolish enough to believe that education should nurture the soul rather than simply polish the surface. Celeste's eyes widened. "A professor? But that would mean—" "I made the mistake of defending a student," Jasper continued, his voice heavy with old pain. "A boy named Marcus who had been born with a clubfoot. He was brilliant, could recite entire plays from memory, wrote poetry that made grown men weep. But Professor Blackwood wanted him expelled because his physical imperfection reflected poorly on the academy's image." "What happened?" Celeste whispered, though she feared she already knew. "I stood up to Blackwood in front of the entire faculty. I argued that Marcus's mind was more beautiful than any perfect body, that true virtue lay in character rather than appearance." Jasper's laugh was bitter. "I was dismissed the next day. My academic credentials were revoked, my reputation destroyed. The only reason I wasn't cast out entirely was because the academy needed someone to maintain the parts of the building they wanted to forget existed. The pieces fell into place like a puzzle, revealing its hidden picture. So you've been hiding, here, taking care of the forgotten things." "The forgotten things and the forgotten people," he said, meeting her eyes. "Celeste, you're not the only student who's found refuge in these shadows. There are others, students and former faculty members, who don't fit Blackwood's vision of perfection. We've been meeting in secret, creating a community for those the academy has cast aside, As if summoned by his words, soft footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Celeste tensed, but Jasper rose calmly and moved to the door. "It's all right," he called softly. "You can come in." The door opened to reveal a small group of people unlike any Celeste had ever seen gathered together at the academy. There was a girl about her own age with a port wine birthmark covering half her face. A young man who moved with the careful gait of someone whose legs had never been quite straight, and an older woman whose graying hair fell freely around her shoulders instead of being pinned in the academy's prescribed style. "Everyone," Jasper said gently. "This is Celeste. Celeste. Meet the underground." The girl with the birthmark stepped forward first, her smile genuine and warm. "I'm Willa," she said. "I've been hiding in the art studios after hours, painting portraits of people the Academy would call flawed. Jasper told us about you." "I'm Marcus," said the young man with the uneven gait, and Celeste realized this was the student Jasper had tried to protect. "I never got to thank him properly for standing up for me, but I've been helping other students who need a safe place to exist." The older woman introduced herself as Professor Evelyn Hartwell, formerly of the History Department. "I was dismissed for suggesting that our curriculum should include stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, rather than just tales of perfect heroes," she said with a rueful smile. Apparently, that was considered subversive thinking. As the afternoon wore on, more people emerged from the shadows. Students who hid scars, teachers who had been silenced for showing compassion, staff members who had been demoted for treating the imperfect students with dignity. Each had a story of rejection and resilience, and each had found their way to this hidden community where differences were not just tolerated, but celebrated. "We call ourselves the Underground," explained Professor Hartwell, "because we exist in the spaces the Academy pretends don't exist. But we're more than just a support group. We're working to document what's really happening here, gathering evidence of Blackwood's systematic cruelty." "To what end?" Celeste asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Change," said Jasper, simply. "The Academy wasn't always like this. Before Blackwood arrived 5 years ago, this institution actually lived up to its name. It taught virtue in the truest sense. Compassion, wisdom, courage, justice. He's perverted it into something ugly, and we're going to expose the truth. But how?" Celeste's voice was small. "He has all the power. The Board of Governors supports him. The wealthy families love him because he makes their children feel superior, and the kingdom's nobility send their sons and daughters here because of his reputation for producing perfect graduates." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes bright with the same intensity she'd learned to recognize in Jasper. "We have something he doesn't expect, the testimony of those he's tried to silence. And we have someone with access to the inner workings of the Academy's most influential family." It took Celeste a moment to realize he was talking about her. "Me, but I'm nobody. My own family is ashamed of me." "That's exactly why you're perfect for this," said Willa. "You move through the Academy invisible, dismissed as harmless. You hear conversations, see documents, witness cruelties that they don't bother to hide because they don't consider you important enough to worry about. More than that," added Professor Hartwell, "you have something even more valuable. A sister who is at the very heart of Blackwood's inner circle. Cordelia has access to information we desperately need." The mention of her sister sent a familiar stab of pain through Celeste's chest. "Cordelia won't help me. She's made it clear that she considers me an embarrassment." "Then we don't ask her to help," said Jasper quietly. "We help ourselves." Over the following days, Celeste found herself drawn deeper into the Underground's activities. What had begun as stolen moments of reading in a forgotten library had evolved into something far more significant. A mission to reclaim the Academy's lost soul. She discovered talents she never knew she possessed. Her lifetime of invisibility had taught her to observe, to notice details others missed. Her stutter, which had always been a source of shame, proved useful when she needed to appear harmless and non-threatening, to eavesdrop on important conversations. Most surprisingly, her withered arm, which she had spent years hiding, turned out to be perfectly suited for slipping through narrow spaces to retrieve documents from locked offices. The underground had been collecting evidence for months, but Celeste's inside access to the Thornwick family accelerated their progress dramatically. During family dinners at home, she listened as her father discussed academy business with colleagues. When Cordelia practiced her speeches as Virtue Princess, Celeste memorized every word, noting which students were being targeted for removal and which families were being courted for their influence. The turning point came 3 weeks later, during the Academy's monthly disciplinary hearing. Celeste had learned that a first-year student named Timothy, whose only crime was a severe case of acne that marred his otherwise pleasant face, was to be expelled for failure to maintain academy standards. It was a death sentence for the boy's future. No other institution would accept a student dismissed from the Academy of Virtues. That night, the underground gathered in the forgotten library to plan their response. The room buzzed with nervous energy as they finalized the details of what they had decided to call the revelation. "Are you sure about this?" Professor Hartwell asked Celeste for the dozenth time. "Once we take this step, there's no going back. Blackwood will know exactly who betrayed him, and he'll come for you first." Celeste looked around the room at the faces of people who had become more family to her than her own blood relatives. Marcus, whose poetry had flourished in their secret meetings. Willa, whose portraits captured the true beauty in faces the Academy deemed flawed. Professor Hartwell, whose banned history lessons had shown them that change was always possible. And Jasper, whose love had taught her that she was not broken but simply waiting for someone who could see her completeness. "I'm sure," she said, her voice clear and strong. "They can't keep pretending we don't exist." The next morning, as the Academy gathered for its weekly assembly, Celeste took her usual place in the back corner. But today was different. Today, she was not alone in her exile. Throughout the Great Hall, members of the underground had positioned themselves strategically, some in the audience, others near the exits, all waiting for the signal. Professor Blackwood took the stage with his usual air of cold authority, his silver hair gleaming under the crystal chandeliers, his pale eyes surveying the assembled students like a general reviewing his troops. He began with the morning recitation, his voice carrying the familiar litany of the Academy's supposed virtues. "Excellence in form, perfection in function, beauty in being," the students chanted in unison, their voices echoing off the marble walls. "Today," Blackwood announced when the recitation ended, "we address a matter of institutional hygiene. It has come to our attention that certain undesirable elements have been attempting to undermine the Academy's sacred mission." Celeste's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to remain still. Around the hall, she could see other members of the underground tensing, ready for whatever was to come. "Therefore," Blackwood continued, "effective immediately, any student found to be in violation of our physical and social standards will be subject to immediate expulsion. We will no longer tolerate the presence of those who taint our perfect community with their imperfections." The hall erupted in whispers as students looked around nervously, suddenly aware that any perceived flaw might mark them for removal. Celeste saw fear bloom on faces that had always worn masks of confident superiority. That was the signal. Celeste rose from her chair, her movement causing a ripple of surprised murmurs. In 18 years of life, she had never voluntarily drawn attention to herself. But today, supported by the love and courage of those who had shown her true worth, she found her voice. "No," she said, the single word cutting through the babble like a bell. The hall fell silent. Every eye turned toward her, including Blackwood's pale gaze, which fixed on her with the intensity of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "Beg your pardon, Miss Thornwick?" His voice was silk wrapped around steel. Celeste stepped into the aisle, her uneven gait carrying her toward the front of the hall. With each step, she felt the weight of every stare, heard the whispers following in her wake. But she also felt something else. The presence of Jasper and the others, their support flowing toward her like a warm tide. "I said no," she repeated, her voice growing stronger. "No, we will not be silent anymore. No, we will not accept your definition of worth. And no, we will not allow you to destroy young lives for the crime of being human. Blackwood's composure cracked slightly, his eyes narrowing. Sit down, Miss Thornwick, before you embarrass yourself further. I am not embarrassed, Celeste declared, reaching the front of the hall and turning to face the assembled students. For the first time in my life, I am not embarrassed by who I am. Around the hall, other members of the underground began to stand. Marcus rose from his seat in the middle section, his uneven stance proud and defiant. Willa stood near the front, her birthmark visible to everyone, her chin lifted high. Professor Hartwell emerged from the faculty section, her gray hair flowing, free. You see these people? Celeste continued, gesturing to her friends. Professor Blackwood calls them imperfect, flawed, unworthy of this institution. But I have learned something in these past months that this academy never taught me. That true beauty lies not in flawless features or perfect proportions, but in courage, kindness, and the strength to love despite the world's cruelty. Enough. Blackwood's voice cracked like a whip across the hall. Security, remove this girl immediately. But the security guards, several of whom were secret members of the underground, remained motionless. Around the hall, more students began to stand. Not all of them, but enough to send a clear message that change was inevitable. You want to know what real imperfection looks like? Celeste asked, her voice carrying to every corner of the great hall. It looks like a man who mistakes cruelty for strength, who confuses fear with respect, who has forgotten that the purpose of education is to nurture souls, not to crush them. She turned to face Blackwood directly, this man who had terrorized her and countless others with his rigid standards and cold judgment. I am not perfect, she said clearly. My arm is withered, my speech sometimes falters, and my gait is uneven. But I am not broken. I am not a mistake. I am exactly who I was meant to be, and no amount of your cruelty can change that. The hall had fallen completely silent, as if the very stones were holding their breath. In that silence, Celeste heard the soft sound of footsteps and turned to see Jasper walking down the center aisle toward her. He moved with quiet confidence, his simple clothes a stark contrast to the academy's elaborate uniforms, his calloused hands steady at his sides. And this, Celeste said as he reached her, is the man who taught me my worth. Not a perfect specimen of academy breeding, but someone who sees beauty where others see only flaws. Jasper took her hand, her withered hand, and lifted it gently to his lips. The gesture was simple, tender, and utterly revolutionary in a place that had taught her to hide her differences. I love you, he said quietly, but his words carried in the crystalline silence. Not despite your imperfections, but because you are perfectly yourself. The spell that had held the hall in thrall finally broke. Some students gasped, others whispered, and a few even began to applaud. But Blackwood's face had gone white with rage. This is intolerable, he snarled. I will not have this institution's reputation destroyed by the delusions of a defective girl and her equally flawed companion. Actually, came a new voice from the back of the hall, I think you'll find that your tenure here is the thing that's about to end. All heads turned to see an elderly man in expensive robes walking down the center aisle, flanked by several official-looking companions. Celeste recognized him from portraits in the Academy's main office. Chancellor Mortimer Vale, the kingdom's highest educational authority, and the man to whom even Professor Blackwood answered. Chancellor Vale, Blackwood said, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure. I wasn't expecting your visit today. No, the Chancellor replied. Dryly, I don't imagine you were, especially not after the rather extensive documentation I've received regarding your methods at this institution. He gestured to Professor Hartwell, who stepped forward with a thick portfolio of papers. Thank you, Evelyn. Your former colleagues and I have been most concerned about the reports filtering out of this academy. Reports? Blackwood's mask was slipping further. Oh yes, reports of students being expelled for physical differences they cannot control. Reports of faculty being dismissed for showing basic human compassion. Reports of an institution that has forgotten its founding principles in favor of a twisted philosophy that mistakes uniformity for excellence. Chancellor Vale's gaze swept the assembled crowd, taking in the students still standing in solidarity with Celeste, the faculty members who had emerged from hiding, and the young woman at the center of it all who had found the courage to speak. Truth to power. Miss Thornwick, he said, addressing Celeste directly. I understand you have something you'd like to say about your experiences here. Celeste looked at Jasper, who squeezed her hand encouragingly, then at the faces of her friends in the underground, who nodded their support. Finally, she looked at her sister Cordelia, sitting in the front row with the other Academy elite, her perfect features frozen in shock.
Yes, sir,
Celeste said clearly.
I have a great deal to say. What followed was the most extraordinary hour in the Academy of Virtue's history. One by one, the members of the underground told their stories, tales of cruelty disguised as standards,
of young lives nearly destroyed by an institution that had forgotten its purpose, of talents wasted and spirits crushed in the name of an impossible perfection. When the last testimony had been given, Chancellor Vale stood to address the assembled crowd. Professor Blackwood, he said formally, you are hereby dismissed from your position, effective immediately. A full investigation into your practices will begin tomorrow, and I suspect criminal charges may follow. Blackwood opened his mouth to protest, but the Chancellor held up a hand for silence. Furthermore, this academy will undergo a complete restructuring. Its mission will return to the original charter, to nurture the minds and spirits of all students regardless of their physical appearance or social standing. He turned to Celeste, his expression kind. Miss Thornwick, I understand you have some thoughts about who might be qualified to lead this institution in a new direction. Celeste smiled, thinking of the community that had formed in the shadows, the teachers who had risked everything to show compassion, the students who had learned to find beauty in difference. Yes, sir. I believe I do. 6 months later, as autumn painted the Academy's grounds in shades of gold and scarlet, Celeste stood in the great hall once again. But this time she was not alone in the back corner. She stood at the front of the room beside Professor Hartwell, now Headmistress Hartwell, addressing a new class of incoming students. Welcome to the Academy of Virtues, she said, her voice clear and strong. Here, we believe that true virtue lies not in perfection but in authenticity, not in uniformity, but in the courage to be exactly who you are. In the audience, she could see familiar faces. Marcus, now a published poet and the Academy's new literature instructor. Willa, whose portraits hung in the main gallery as examples of art that captured the soul rather than just the surface. And dozens of others who had found their voices in the underground and were now helping to rebuild the Academy from within. And there, in the front row, sat Jasper, no longer a maintenance worker hiding in forgotten corners, but Professor Nightingale, once again his academic credentials restored and his reputation rehabilitated. Their eyes met across the room, and he smiled the same warm smile that had first shown her what it meant to be seen. That evening, as the sun set behind the Academy's towers, Celeste and Jasper walked hand in hand through the gardens. The old forgotten library had been restored and reopened, its dusty halls now filled with students discovering the joy of stories that celebrated every kind of hero. Do you ever regret it? Jasper asked as they paused beside a fountain where water danced in crystalline arcs. Everything you gave up, everything you risked? Celeste considered the question seriously. She thought of her family, her parents who had slowly begun to see her worth as her story spread throughout the kingdom. Her sister Cordelia, who had publicly apologized and was now one of the Academy's most vocal advocates for change. She thought of the students who now came to her for guidance, young people who had been taught to hide their differences until they learned that those very differences were their greatest strengths. I didn't give up anything, she said finally. I found everything I was meant to be. As if to emphasize her point, a young girl with a pronounced limp approached them shyly. Miss Celeste, she said, could you help me with my speech for tomorrow? I'm supposed to tell the class about my hero and I want to tell them about you. Celeste knelt to the girl's level, taking her small hands in her own. I would be honored, she said, but first, let me tell you about the real heroes. The People who taught me that being different isn't something to fix but something to celebrate. Later that night, as she and Jasper sat in their favorite spot in the restored library, surrounded by books that told every kind of story about every kind of person, Celeste reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had begun as a girl who believed herself broken, unworthy of love or acceptance. But she had learned the most important truth of all, that sometimes the things the world calls flaws are actually the very qualities that make us precious. In Jasper's eyes, she had never been broken. She had been exactly what she was, a treasure, waiting to be discovered by someone wise enough to see beyond the surface. And in learning to love herself as he loved her, she had found the strength to help others discover their own hidden worth. The Academy of Virtues had been transformed, but more importantly, so had she. No longer the shunned daughter hiding in shadows, she had become a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. As Jasper read aloud from a new book, a collection of stories written by former underground members about the beauty of imperfection, Celeste closed her eyes and listened to his gentle voice filling the space where they had first discovered that love sees not what is broken, but what is whole. She was and had always been exactly as precious as he had told her that first day in the dusty library. She was not broken. She was not a mistake. She was a treasure beyond measure. And finally, she knew it herself.